Good evening, shalom, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Never Again Live. I'm joined with Meir Jolovitz, and we're going to be discussing Gaza. What is the Jewish plan, the real Jewish plan for Gaza? What are the plans being proposed? What is Israel to do? And how should we be advocating for Israel? Meir, there's a lot going on. There was, I just saw a brief video the other night of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he was giving brachas as he always did. Lineups of people coming for brachas. He would give them $1, and he would give them a bracha, and they would ask him questions, either personal questions or questions pertaining to Israel. And he was visited by a gentleman who was building homes for Jews in Gaza. That's going back quite a few years. And the Jewish man asked him for a bracha for that endeavor. And the Rebbe was very clear. He said that Israel must fully control Gaza. And that's the heart of what's going on right now. We're being told, Israel's being lectured, that they should get out, have a permanent ceasefire, allow the Palestinian Authority / Hamas, its revolving door, to rule Gaza. Israel should not be in control of monitoring or full security of the border between Gaza and Egypt, where all the arms were coming in to Gaza. But according to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, absolutely no. Israel should have complete control in every facet of Gaza. And when it comes to UNRWA, who Israel just declared as a terrorist organization, we have the IHR, the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. UNRWA teaching, if Israel has full control, not at all, not a chance. Meir, how are you tonight, and what could you add?
Status quo, I would imagine, which is not a good situation to be in because we don't like the status quo. A comment about the Lubavitcher Rebbe. If we had the Lubavitcher Rebbe today as Israel's defense minister, the war would have been over a long time ago. A long time ago.
Right.
It's a shame. He might not have known as much about military strategy as Yoav Gallant, Israel's present defense minister, but whatever knowledge Gallant has as defense minister has done absolutely nothing to bring Israel closer to the total victory that it has been speaking about for so long. And the notion of Israel finding a path to destroying its enemies seems long lost in the past. There's no longer the discussion of a destruction of Hamas and the terror and the threat to Israel. As I mentioned, I think the last time we were on the air, that call for the destruction of Israel's enemies was morphed to the defeat of Israel's enemies, and even that has lost much of its street cred, and Israel is hoping just not to lose the war, which is absolutely imbecilic when you consider that Israel is a superpower facing a group of savages who happen to have weapons that were provided by Iran, that were financed by Qatar through tunnels which were done in cooperation with Egypt. And these are the very nations, and financed indirectly, of course, by the United States. And these are the very nations and entities that Israel seems to pretend, at least for public relations purposes, is Israel's ally. We've got to stop this nonsense. Every morning when I wake up, or every night when I go to bed, every morning when I go to bed, It's the same old thing. It's Israeli soldiers, another one, another two, another four Israeli soldiers who fell. These are not soldiers who needed to fall. I know that you gave title to the discussion that we're going to be having today about the Jewish interest in Gaza. And allow me, there's not much occasion lately to talk about offer some levity, but I just want to mention a joke. It's a joke that I heard, I think the first time I heard it was 60 years ago. It's an old joke that used to circulate in Jewish circles, and it still has relevance today. The joke talks about a family of Jews who came to America during this golden age in the 1920s. They knew very little about America, never heard of baseball, but their son, which is often the case, immediately adapted to the American way of life. And the son came home excited one day, one afternoon, and was quite happy to tell his parents that at the game that he went to in Yankee Stadium, Babe Ruth had hit 2 home runs. And the kid was ecstatic. And the two parents, not knowing much about baseball nor about Babe Ruth, looked at their son and they said, "So, how is this good for the Jews?" That was at a time when we were unafraid to talk about what's the Jewish perspective.
Right.
We were unafraid to do that. We didn't have to say that something was good for the Jews without having to qualify, oh, it's good for the rest of the world as well. I heard a spokesman, and I won't go into detail, because he's quite a good friend of the ideology that you and I purvey,
Yep.
who actually in an interview with Piers Morgan dared to say that part of our mission, Israel's mission in Israel, was to help liberate the people of Gaza. No, it isn't. And are you kidding me? Okay, enough of trying to score points by what others might be pleased with our saying. Enough of our pretending to be moderates when moderation will not lead to the victory, certainly not to the defeat of Hamas. What we need to do is go back to this philosophy that those two parents had in the 1920s when they asked their son, "Nu, how is this good for the Jews?" That should be the underlying question that's asked at the War Cabinet every time that they meet. That's my opening comment.
Listen, 100%. You know, when the Jewish Defense League was founded, it was founded primarily it had the strongest moral arguments. We are going to stand up to those bullies who are attacking Jews. Well, there's approximately 15 million Jews in the world, might be 14 million, depending, might be 16 million, depending which demographer you follow. And I think there's close to 2 billion Muslims and Arabs in the world. We're definitely outnumbered. And since day one of Israel's creation, with the rallying cry, Allah Akbar, and slaughter the Jew, they tried that in 1948. 5 Arab armies, and with the Arabs inside the land of Israel, they couldn't accept what Israel was prepared to accept. A small little state that was presented in the Peel Plan, Peel Commission, a small little state. But they decided to pounce on it and try and wipe it out. And they're very clear, we're going to slaughter the Jews and throw them into the sea. Israel, the whole Hasbara apparatus, doesn't seem to present Israel in the proper moral light that we're standing up to the same bullying. People respect that. There's films out today, the Karate Kid, the sequel, Cobra Kai, it's all about bullying. That's a strong moral case. And when we make the case, and just as what you said, that the guest on Piers Morgan was saying we have to liberate the Arabs in Gaza from Hamas. No, 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 no. Those people are the cheerleaders, and they support in every single way the goals and the objectives of Hamas or the Islamic Jihad or whatever terror group you want to call it. And to them, they're not terror groups. They are resistance groups. And the actual word name of Hamas is the Islamic Resistance Movement. They try to take a moral argument and say, well, what do you expect? We are just resisting. No, no, no. We're fighting back. The Jews, we're fighting back against the ultimate bullies that want to carry out and further the goals that were started by Hitler to annihilate the Jewish people completely. So what is the makeup of Gaza, and what should take place in Gaza? Ideally, what should be the goal of Israel? They said it from the start, to dismantle the entire infrastructure of Hamas, and that's quite broad. And the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog, was quite clear about the so-called civilians in Gaza that they have in their kitchen armaments, and they facilitate bombs going off in Israel proper, that they're into it 100%. And we saw the videos that they live streamed on October 7th. Unfortunately, our leaders get boxed into a corner where they don't present the proper moral argument that, yes, the enemy must be expelled, and Israel has to take serious control of Gaza because of the severity of this threat. Go ahead, Meir.
Yeah, allow me to connect two of the elements that you just mentioned. In fact, just a few hours ago, I had my weekly lecture, and I mentioned that first. I mentioned also, as you did a few minutes before, about the Jewish population of the world. The comment that I made in that lecture, which I've made before, and I'm certain I will make once again, is the fact that the Jewish population of the world is 15 million. I said facetiously also that some people put that number at 1 million or two more, and I guess that's the Reconstructionists or the Reform Jews who consider their pets to be Jewish also.
Sure.
And so they inflate, so they inflate their numbers. But the reality is that it's a tragic comment to make, that the Jewish population of the world today in 2024 is the same Jewish population numbers that we had in 1939.
Yeah.
And you mentioned demographers. If you're talking about, you ask any population expert and said that there's a people which in 1939 numbered 15 million people, and in the year 2024 is going to number 15 million also, there's something terribly wrong here. And we know what that is. It's the fact that Jews have been murdered by those people who don't believe the Jews have a right to exist. The second element, second thing that you mentioned it twice, was the whole moral standing. And if there's one thing that absolutely irks me is when I see Israeli spokesmen or very well-intentioned advocates, supporters of Israel who talk about Israel and the idea of fighting a moral war. I give you chapter and verse of what Israel has done in order to make this a moral war, in order to somehow placate those people who they know hate them anyhow. There is nothing moral about treating the terrorists who murdered Jews on October 7th in Israeli hospitals today. There is nothing moral about having the Supreme Court, which is a mind-blowing thing, decide just a few days ago that they would have input as to what type of menu would be served in the prison system where these terrorists from October 7th, would there be enough of, would there be two warm meals to choose from? What would be the side dish? And yes, as one of them said, that chocolates following the meal that they get in prison is actually nutritional way to end with a dessert. This is morality. This is insanity. It's
Right.
absolutely insanity. The moral thing to do is to destroy the enemy. So tomorrow morning, when you and I wake up, we don't go to the internet and find that another Israeli soldier, another good Jewish boy has died for nothing. For nothing. There is nothing moral about fighting a war which allows your enemy a future. The purpose of war is victory at all costs. Victory. The purpose of war is for their sons to die, not ours. And we are so afraid. We want to go to Pierce Morgan and tell him, hold on a second, let me give you chapter and verse, how we have bent over backwards to make this a moral war. And that's the reason that 9 months later, we're still fighting a war that should have been ended in 9 days. That's the problem. And the problem is, it's that whole concept that what will the Gentile say, as opposed to what, I'm going to keep referring to those parents living in the Bronx who said, how is this good for the Jews? The thing is good for the Jews and the thing is good for the state of Israel. And if it's good for the state of Israel, one can then say it will then have to be good for the rest of the world. Is a thriving Jewish civilization at the cost of putting away the destructive culture that surrounds and threatens it. We need to stop being apologetic, and we don't need to know how to do that. I mentioned in the lecture something Rabbi Kahan, it was a favorite, it was one of many, many favorite comments that he would make. He said, you can take the Jew out of the ghetto, but it seems that we've not done as well getting the ghetto out of the Jew.
Right.
It's a shame. It's a shame. And I just want to add this as a final comment to this particular point. Have we really won anything as far as world favor by being moral, as they describe it? Have we really done? Does the world love us more now, because the Supreme Court is actually looking at the menu and the sleeping conditions and the newspapers that the terrorists who kill Jews get to enjoy while they're in Israeli prisons? And if we are pretending that this makes us better than they are, because we treat the murderers of our children in a manner which the world considers to be moral, then there needs to be a redefinition of what morality is. This notion of moral relativism needs to be put away. It needs to be put away. It is immoral to allow the enemy to have any ability to kill your children, period. And if there's a human being in this world who has common sense, who disagrees with it, pathetic. God help us.
As far as the morality of the world, we've seen some recent elections. In France, Marie Le Pen, she got the majority of votes. There's no question about that. But something was done to make sure that she didn't win. Nonetheless, because of Islamic extremism in France, with everything that entails, and in other countries too.
Yeah.
And there's a substantial movement in England, in the UK as well, calling for the expulsion of those who support what I would say on a live broadcast, radical Islam. There's sweeping support for that. Donald Trump, he says those who support Hamas, when he's president, hopefully, he'll expel them. He will deport them. Now, they don't like, your average person doesn't like the presence of radical Islam and everything that they're doing, and there's some instances of terrorism. But in Israel, there are actual cases of terrorism, not just preaching, not just holding rallies, not just disruptive. We're on a completely different level. And the fact that, leftists in Israel and the media that say anyone who advocates a similar policy of expulsion of these enemies is the far right, the extremists, the radicals. I can't think of a more moral principle than saying the enemy who is murdering our people and his support staff that teaches this and wants the eradication of the Jewish state of any size, they should be out. And that should be supported by the Supreme Court.
Yeah. A couple of comments, if I may. You mentioned Europe. If you look at Europe, those nations, mostly in Western Europe, who have been kind, benign to this Islamic assault, this Islamic overtake of their own cultures, these are countries which aren't going to exist in 2050. Islam will have defeated them, and Islam says, including the residents, the Islamic residents of these various, of Belgium, of England, of France, of Norway, of Sweden, they say by the year 2050, and in some cases, I'm telling you, it'll be 2040, these nations will have fallen. When you look at those, a couple of nations in Eastern Europe who refuse to allow these Islamic marauders to come in, they have no such threat or fear of what is to come in another 15 or 20 years. And yet, seemingly intelligent people simply refuse to recognize it because it isn't progressive to think this way. It's absolutely insane. When you were talking about this morality, the Supreme Court in Israel and everything else, in Israel, Israel is to blame to a great degree the mentality which has allowed Israel to capitulate in trying to win favor with the world. There was a decision made by the High Court that was announced earlier today, which basically said that the law in Israel that says that if let's just say a resident of Gaza, an Arab, marries an Israeli Arab, that they are entitled, the law today says they're not entitled to Israeli citizenship. The High Court says they should be entitled to Israeli citizenship. In Israel, if an Israeli Arab engages in an act of terrorism and he is neutralized, killed by the Israeli security forces, his family gets bituach leumi, national security, social security. Why? Because they lost their bread earner. We're out of our minds. It's a nation which has bent over backwards to show the rest of the world, which continues to hate them. And that's the point that needs to be made. This isn't an argument that I make and they say, but look, the world is beginning to love us because of all these things that we do. The world continues to hate you, more so than you thought just a couple of years ago. They condemn you at every level in international courts. They don't allow you to come to academic conferences. They deny you entry to certain tennis matches and soccer matches, and on and on and on. What indeed did we gain by trying to placate those people who hate us? And the answer is nothing. In fact, quite the opposite. What they have shown is they've shown contempt. And I'm going to, once again, I'll quote Rabbi Kahana, who used to famously say, if you don't have self-respect, you'll never get their respect.
Right.
And we are such victims of that nonsense where we just don't understand how they work. We bend over backwards. You'd mentioned Isaac Herzog before. All these Israeli politicians, they play to the press. They play to the United Nations. what you have is you have an Israeli spokesman stand before the United Nations. It's his turn to explain. He's given his 25 minutes to explain to the rest of the world why Israel has a right to exist. And he tries to be as eloquent as he can to try and convince the representative from Cambodia, Burundi, that we have a right to exist. And I'll do it one more time. The rabbi said, talking about this effort, this foolish effort to try and convince the world in the most eloquent way that we have a right to exist. The rabbi said, it was after one occasion when an Israeli spokesman at the United Nations, eloquent, might have been an Abba Ibn, who used to speak 12 languages. The rabbi said,
that too.
he speaks 12 languages beautifully. The problem is he speaks them all at the same time. But anyhow, so he came up and he gave this eloquent speech about why we have a right to exist. We have a right to exist. And the rabbi said, imagine the Secretary General of the United Nations going to the ambassador from Finland or the ambassador from Poland and telling them, by the way, tomorrow you guys each get your 25 minutes to try and explain to the world body why you have a right to exist. And Rabbi said they would both spit in your face, and rightly so. Only the Jew in a superpower of a country, Israel, feels that they have this felt need to be eloquent enough to convince our enemies that we have a right to exist. The moment you do that, we've lost. We've lost. It doesn't take a genius to understand that what we've done to date just hasn't worked. Without being overly polemical, bombastic, whatever. Whatever we've done, it hasn't worked. And yet, I mentioned the United Nations. Take a look at the list of nations which have had their turn to chair the Human Rights Commission, the Human Rights Commission, or the Commission for Women's Human Rights, Equal Rights, whatever. You're talking about some of the most oppressive and barbaric nations that we have ever known. They get their seat at the table. Israel, the people, the nation, which civilized the world, can't find a region in the United Nations which will accept it in order for Israel to be eligible to be one of the 47 nations which make up this committee. Why? Because the Asians said, well, Israel really isn't in Asia. Europeans are saying, well, Israel isn't in Europe. The Africans are saying, well, my God, it's certainly not in Africa. So Israel sits there in the corner, in the dark corner, watching all these oppressive, totalitarian, authoritarian states getting their turn on the Human Rights Commission, and Israel sits there and petitions to be loved. Pathetic. Pathetic. If I can go, because Meir, just for a few minutes, I know you wanted to talk about Gaza. The thinking of the part of the Western world, and I say Western world because they at least share a Judeo-Christian connection to Israel, to the Jewish people. And yet, most, if not all of the nations of the Western world, the Enlightenment, these democratic states, these civilized states, they can't decide who is right and who's wrong in this conflict in the Middle East. This Arab war against the Jew, the Muslim war against the Arab war against Israel, or the Muslim war against the Jew. They can't decide who's right or wrong. But most of the time they decide who's right or wrong. And it's that the victim is wrong and the murderer or the potential murderer is the side that's right. And we simply don't understand that if you stand up, no one, a phrase I used to use in speeches which I gave, oh my God, 40 years ago. Nobody likes a bootlicker. particularly the
Right.
person whose boots are being licked. The
Right.
person who
100%.
who's licked the least is the person whose boots are being licked. It's not someone you can respect. Israel needs to stop that. And part of the problem that Israel has is even within Israel, this whole leftist progressive mentality. And mind you, the leftists are a small minority of Israel. They're a small minority.
Hmm.
Those people self-identify as leftists. Those people identify right of center are much greater in number. And yet there's this thinking that if we somehow, as I said, placate the complaints of the rest of the world, whatever, they'll come to like us more. The discussion that's being held, even as we speak now, between Egypt and Qatar and the United States, and on occasion Turkey, as to how we manage and what we do to manage a future Gaza. And most of the people are pointing to a Palestinian Authority. Palestinian Authority, an authority that can't even control its own territory, which now has domain over in Judea and Samaria, West Bank. All of a sudden, the United States is going to get behind it. Today, it was announced by whom, of course, Samantha Power, who's the head of U.S. aid, that the United States is going to give an additional $100 million. That's just additional. Today, that
Right.
was just morning for the poor Palestinians in Gaza. Why not give $100 million to help rebuild the homes of those Jews whose families were slaughtered on October 7th? It's because we've accepted the status quo for what it is. And that's our biggest mistake. And I've always argued, and I don't mean this just in emotional terms, I mean in geostrategic terms, that the moment that Israel stands firm and says, no, we're going to do what's best for Israel and damn the world, that most of the good countries will fall in line with us. The fact that we bend over backwards and give them reason to believe that part of our mission is to liberate the people of Gaza? Are you kidding me?
It's ridiculous.
This is where we lose the game. This is where we lose the game. The same commentator, by the way, and Piers Morgan, talked about the fact that Israel needs to find, whether it be with the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Morocco.
You know what, Meir, there's something going on with your volume right now.
I'm getting. Is that any
That's
better?
good. That's good.
I was
Yep.
getting a phone call coming in. But
Okay.
the comment was, the comment that was coming in. Thank you for that. The comment that was made was that Israel needs to find better friends, such as the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Morocco. Well, I can understand Morocco being asked to come into Gaza because it's been a while since I've looked, but doesn't Morocco share a border with Gaza? What is this nonsense about bringing Morocco and the UAE and Saudi Arabia to Gaza? Gaza needs to be governed by Israel, period.
Right.
Gaza needs to be settled by Israel. Because, and I'm going to remind the audience of something that they already know. This is a major war. But there have been mini wars, there have been operations. In December of 2008 and January of 2009, there was the first war the CAS led in Gaza. The war, the mini war, the operation was ended with a ceasefire. There was another mini war, an operation of Israel going into Gaza in 2012. It ended with a ceasefire. In 2000, and we know the score, we know where we're going with this. 2014, once again, this is a big one. Israel said no more. Israel said we will punish Hamas in such a way that Hamas will never respond again with rockets. There was a ceasefire, and the moment that the ceasefire was called, rockets were launched again. And finally, we had May of 2021, another one, 4,369 rockets. It's terrible. I lecture frequently, and it's terrible, as I think I mentioned in a previous broadcast, that I actually can tell you the number of missiles or rockets that were fired from Gaza into Israel in May of 2021. 4,369. And how did it end? with a ceasefire, which we were told at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, this will teach them a lesson and they will not strike again. While at the very same time, we're bringing in Arab workers, those who support, finance, and celebrate Hamas. We bring them into Israel. Most people don't know because Israel's been quiet about it. There have been already 2 or 3 discussions during this present war where Israel is actually increasing the number of Arab workers coming into Israel in order to what? To help with the economy, because the economy is strained by the war. Was there a lesson to be learned from yesteryear, from 9 months ago? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Which is the reason why I have often given speeches which I subtitle The Myth of Jewish Intelligence.
Yeah.
Tragic.
Who would you say is responsible for? We find these tunnels. Israel finds these tunnels that weapons are being smuggled from. They find over 50 tunnels and sub-tunnels too, with weapons coming in from Egypt. Who is ultimately responsible for that in the security establishment in Israel? Like, how is it Israel didn't know? With all the technology that Israel has, their spy network, and I'm ready to just say that Egypt colluded with Hamas. So, but Israel has to have great intelligence. How come it's a surprise?
Because we're fools. It's not a surprise. And I'm glad you said that. I just pulled out a little piece that I want to read. The Yom Kippur War. Everyone talks about the fact that 2,656 Israeli soldiers died, who need not have died because Israel knew that there was going to be attack. Kissinger told Israel not to strike first, take the first blow and the world will be with you, and so on and so forth. Intelligence didn't fail in the Yom Kippur War to anticipate a strike from Egypt and Syria. Intelligence failed in the way that they responded to the information that they had. In this particular case, there are 2 sides of the coin. We know the stories, and if an official inquiry is done, which is really comprehensive, we will know what we already know. That there were so many warnings that were given to the senior command of Israel military intelligence, of the Shabak and others. Everything, chapter and verse, videos, films, everything. The Arabs training. So the intelligence was there. It responded to the intelligence, which was a failure, a complete failure. There should be people in prison today who are prosecuting the war right now. They should be in prison, and others should be prosecuting the war. But I want to come back to the thing. I actually pulled this out. I have it readily available because I was going to use it in my lecture today. I always run out of time, and it's a long lecture. I always do 90 minutes. It always runs 100 minutes. But here's an article I'm just going to read because it's a perfect response to what you just asked, Meir. This is from May 22nd of this year. We're talking about this is a month and a half ago. A month and a half ago. I'm going to read the headline. Now, this comes from memory. Well, a lot of people out there know memory. I'm reading the headline. It's a long headline. Egyptian-American political analyst Magdi Khalil says the following. Egypt has never fully embraced peace with Israel, consistently violates the Camp David Accords by treating Israel like an enemy, cooperating with Hamas, allowing widespread anti-Semitic discourse. That was the headline. And it goes into detail. I'm not going to do it here. It's a couple of pages of all the quote it's quite apparent. You don't have to have an intelligence apparatus to understand that Egypt is not Israel's friend. The reason Egypt had a peace treaty with Israel is because Anwar Sadat understood that he could win by saying peace what he couldn't win with tanks. Okay? and the Sinai, 2.5 times the size of Israel proper. And yet we see that the Egyptians, what's the second biggest seller? And for many, many years, it was the number one seller of books sold in Egypt. It was the Protocols of Elders of Zion.
Yep.
What was also in the top 10? Mein Kampf in Arabic. Okay? To pretend that Egypt is a friend of Israel is insanity. It's what Eric Hoffer referred to. We lie the loudest when we lie to ourselves. But anyhow, here's a person who's making a comment, and he says this is for Israel to think that Egypt was its friend it's either a fraud or Israeli intelligence that really doesn't know what's going on. That was the one side of the coin. That other side of the coin that I wanted to reference was what you mentioned, Meir, the tunnels. If one place where the Israeli intelligence did fail, it wasn't with what I just read, that he admits that Egypt is not Israel's friend, but rather the extent of the duplicity that we saw from Egypt in the manner by which they shared tunnels with Hamas. Now, we know that Hamas and Egypt weren't meant to be bedfellows. So the Egyptians have a very simple understanding with Hamas. If you direct your vitriol in the other direction at Israel, you will find that we will tolerate your existence. In fact, we might actually facilitate your existence. And that's exactly what's happened. Because Egypt, the present Egyptian government, isn't interested in having a Muslim brotherhood, but they'd rather have a Muslim brotherhood that directs its venom against Israel. Where Israeli intelligence failed, and miserably, and continues to fail, is in having determined the absolute magnitude of the preparation that Hamas had made in preparing for war. As I'm speaking to you, here, may I have a few more minutes, Mayor, just to make a point?
Sure.
Okay. I want to pull this, I'm going to pull in, I did this in anticipation about doing this discussion. I'm going to pull something out. This is from September of 2023. September of 2023 is, in fact, this was done, this is 3 weeks before the October 7th attack. Okay? September 2023. I'm going to quote Dennis Ross. Dennis Ross, for those people who've been following Middle East affairs for some time, know he was the director of policy planning for the State Department with George Bush. He was the Middle East coordinator with Bill Clinton. He also worked with Hillary Clinton as the special advisor to the Persian Gulf, Iran, and also Southwest Asia. Here's what Dennis Ross said. This is what Dennis Ross said in September of 2023, less than a year ago, in reference to his argument that he had when he was working with Hillary Clinton, in which he told Israel that Israel needed to be a little more understanding of Hamas's needs. I'm going to read you the quote. This is Dennis Ross. This is the same disease that plagues Israelis, and I'm talking about on the political level and on the military level. This is the disease of Oslo. This is what Dennis Ross said in September of 2023. I argued with Israeli leaders and security officials, telling them they needed to allow more construction materials, including cement, into Gaza so that housing, schools, and basic infrastructure could be built. They counted that Hamas would misuse it. And they were right. And they were right. What a goddamn consolation that Dennis Ross tells us today. You were right. Explain that to all the Jews who have died. Because Dennis Ross and the United States and the State Department and idiots at the most senior positions in Israel actually believed that it was going for the construction of housing, schools, basic infrastructure. It's remarkable. And the only thing that I would say is, when all this discussion is done, not just between the two of us, elsewhere, between Israeli officials and American officials and all the other forums that are held, all the think tanks, inappropriately named think tanks, will anyone say that there's a lesson of history that seems not to be learned by Israel? And the answer is that would be a very faint voice.
Right.
The lesson of history seems never to be learned by Israel, as evidenced by the fact that the Supreme Court is worried about the menu that the terrorists have, that Israeli hospitals are treating in the same manner that they would treat you or your children, treating terrorists in hospitals. Why? Because we are such a moral people. No, that is an immoral thing to do.
So there's a lot of polls that are coming out in Israel. If elections are held now, this is how many seats Likud would get, and Yair Lapid would get, and all these guys, all these characters. And Yair Lapid, he's saying, go for the American plan, Bibi, and don't worry about the threats from Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. If they threaten to pull out, they pull out. We will back you in the Knesset. Yeah, we'll back you in the Knesset. So Hamas could rule, or slash the PA could rule, and so assuming because I mean, even if that was the case, that Bibi gave in to that and wanted that kind of support from Lapid and Gantz and all that, or to do that kind of a deal. We know that the next day there's going to be elections anyways, because Gantz and Lapid, they can't stand Bibi anyways. I mean, that's very clear. So there would be an election, but if there is to be an election, with what we know of what's going on and how we see Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, how they're showing in the polls, and and the polls don't even include the military votes either. What kind of and potential people that would be drawn to them that see reality of what's going on. What do you envision as realistically, if there is an election?
Well, there doesn't have to be an election until November of 2026.
Right, I know.
If the 64 members of the present coalition
Stay
do
there.
what they need to do, but they capitulate to the pressures that they see. Let me make a comment about that. You will hear every single day coming from the left of center, certainly from the left, all kinds of vitriolic comments made about the fact that, well, they mentioned two people. They mentioned obviously Itamar Ben-Gvir, and they mentioned Bezalel Smotrich.
Yeah.
And they said these people don't belong these people are screaming, both religious Zionists, both who believe in the Zionist dream, both who believe in the concept of a viable Jewish kingdom. They don't belong in the Knesset, these people will scream. Have any of these people ever said that Ayman Oda shouldn't be in the Knesset? That Ahmed Tibi shouldn't be in the Knesset? That Mansour Abbas shouldn't be in the... No. In fact, this newly formed Democratic Party, all in the name of Democratia. What a nonsense. This union, all of a sudden, it's two people, two movements which are drowning, and so they're grabbing hold of each other in order to try and stay afloat. The Labor Party and Meretz. And it's remarkable that Yair Golan, who was just a short time ago head of the Meretz Party, is now the head of the Labor Party, and he's obviously with the ties. So what's the first thing they said? We're looking to establish coalition with whomever will join us. And yes, the Arabs are expected to be part of us. That's okay. No one criticizes them. But when an Itamar Ben-Gvir said that we need to settle Gaza, there need to be Jewish communities in Gaza the way they were before August of 2005, when we forcefully dragged out some of Israel's finest, they become the naysayers. They become the party. A comment about the election, because you asked. The polls in Israel change all the time.
Sure.
When you and I had this discussion 4 months ago, 5 months ago, and we looked at the polls at the time, and we talked about the fact that they change quite readily. At the time, Bibi's popularity, because he was in fact the prime minister when October 7th happened, it had died. I mean, he was looking, and it still isn't looking good. But the person who all of a sudden was catapulted from the ash heap of history, all of a sudden became, they said at one point the polls were showing him at 41, 43 seats instead of, was Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz. Now, Benny Gantz has dropped to 21, 22. Type of thing, when if you listen to Benny Gantz, you realize there's a very stupid man. But I want to make another comment about Benny Gantz. Benny Gantz in 2015 gave a press conference in English, readily available on the internet, in English, and he was talking about his days as the chief in 2014 in one of these operations that I referenced before in Gaza. And he mentioned that there was an episode where rockets were being fired from a building which was immediately proximate to a hospital, a Shifa hospital, and asked what he did, what was to be done about it. And he said quite openly, he said, I decided to risk my own Golani soldiers, he said, going in and fighting hand to hand, knowing that some would die, rather than using artillery in order to take it out, because he was concerned about what the BBC might say. The worst part of that was this, that he paused and said on 2 occasions in this interview, and it was the moral thing to do. That, I think, is more troubling, and it was the moral thing to do.
Right.
To risk his own soldiers in order not to somehow fall prey to the criticisms of a Western press. And this is the person who was Israel's chief of staff at the time, becomes defense minister, and the polls showed almost a runaway prime minister. This is the problem with Israel. This is the problem. And it's not a problem that will be solved. If you're asking me, is there an election we can look forward to that's going to solve these problems that you and I are quite good in identifying? The answer is there is.
I think it would be a stalemate if there's an election. I don't see any winner when it comes down to it. If you present the issues, because there's been a lot of people from the far left that were affected directly October 7th, that they have changed their views completely from so-called peaceniks to not at all. I don't think it's going to be a runaway. As long as the issues are presented clear, I don't see it happening.
Can I disagree with you for one moment?
Yep.
And it's only a matter of nuance. Nuance.
Yep.
There were many liberals in Israel who have in fact shifted, who had a wake-up call on October 7th. The left remained left.
Yep. Yeah. I agree.
Okay.
I agree. I just don't see any over 60 seat coalition being formed that's going to be like a left. I don't see a repeat of Naftali Bennett, Yair Lapid, and gang and all that. Right now, you throw their names out. Everybody's hyped up right now. There's no election date set or anything like that. And polls are polls. But as is happening right now with Gantz, taking a deep dive, that will also take a deep dive. I'd say that also, but I would include also Yossi Cohen, who I have a lot of admiration for him, former head of the Mossad, kinds of phenomenal. However, as the head of Mossad, we got the issue of these tunnels. Like, what is going on with the intelligence when there's questions that are going to be asked? Nobody could, unless it's going to be a botched commission of inquiry that nobody gets to ask. But with social media, everybody does get to ask also.
The supposition that the Israeli politic, that the Israeli population will, in response to an event, always then move and do the right thing is a fraudulent one. Now, obviously, we know that when Golda Meir blew it when it came to Yom Kippur and the response that we had, she summarily left office. Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
People, okay, and it was just a couple of years later that Menachem Begin, a couple of years later, Menachem Begin was elected on May 17th, 1977. Okay,
Yeah.
that we know. But in Israel, here it is. If one looks at the polls, and you and I have talked about it often about how they shift, all of a sudden, who's considered the person who's going to come in on the white horse? Naftali Bennett. Hold on a second. Naftali Bennett, who, by the way, has been saying a lot of the right things lately, but things that he didn't say when he was prime minister.
Right.
Naftali Bennett is saying some of the things that he said when he was running for prime minister before he put together a coalition government with Mansour Abbas, the Iran party, with them, first time ever.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's now beginning to say, because he understands that it moves the electoral needle, so to speak. But then again, this is a guy who blew it when he had the opportunity. He was a guy who was part of this group that was willing to agree to 53 billion shekels to be sent to the Arabs, 53 billion shekels, which with the terms of conversion was $16.5 billion to be given to the Arab sector in order to get the Arabs to be what? To be more moderate, to say, look, that same belief that moderation, that a better way of life would all of a sudden make them somehow philo-Semites or strong advocates of Zionism.
Right.
The tragedy in Israel, and it is several generations old, is that there's always been a larger right wing. And when I say right wing, I'm talking about right of center, which encompasses quite a broad range. There's been a larger right of center element in politics than there has in the other direction, certainly in the last two generations.
Yep.
But they can never get together. They can never get together. And that's a problem that Israel suffers all the time.
Right.
There isn't, instead, the little parties become the kingmakers and what have you. And what happens also is that you still find these politicians at every level, certainly the prime minister's position, who try to bend over backward to placate the Western world, to make the State Department hate them less. And this is where we pay that terrible price. There is a simple thing, and I'm sure we'll talk about it. We didn't talk about it today, even though we've sort of obliquely referenced it, which is the two-state delusion. The two-state delusion is the end of Israel. It's the most dangerous thing. And yet you've got a lot of people who one would actually say, these are well-meaning people, these are good people, these are Zionists, who simply think maybe a two-state solution is the only answer, completely oblivious to the situation that we find ourselves in today. And it's really remarkable. I've in Congress, there are a couple of people who are considered to be senators, very, very strong friends of Israel. I'll use an example. Lindsey Graham. Every time Lindsey Graham comes to Israel, he says the right things, and he means it. He means it. He says the right things. He loves the Jewish people. He loves Israel. He thinks Israel should be strong. Israel should never be in this position. He thinks the United States should give Israel all the arms that it needs. He thinks Israel should use the arms as it sees fit to use, not the way that Jake Sullivan or Anthony Blinken think. All the right things. And I saw him a couple of months ago, and he was talking, he said all the right things, bombastic support for Israel. And he says, when Israel finally cleans up this mess and destroys Hamas, we can look to a brighter future when there'll be a two-state solution.
I know.
What can I say? What can I say? Well, I will say, because I look at the clock and I realize that our hour is almost up. I will say this, that the lesson of yesteryear is never learned. Never.
Right.
It's never learned. If there were two takeaways that should have been the obvious from October 7th, is that a two-state solution will never happen. Will never happen.
Right.
October 7th was supposed to bury that notion. And the second one was that if you put your faith in false friends, you're going to pay the price. And Israel put its faith in false friends, and you end up paying the price.
Oh,
It's
absolutely.
something we just have not learned.
100%.
I know, as I usually end my conversations with you, I will let you say goodbye to this wonderful audience you have. I've done this before. I did this last year. Meir, if you and I are doing a couple more podcasts in the future, I'll do it again, because it needs to be heard time and again, and certainly needs to be heard by someone who hadn't heard it before. It's a very simple close. It's exactly 100 years ago, 1924, that a prolific Jewish author wrote a book which was titled "You Gentiles." And the last page, he has a thing called a last word. A last word. And I'm going to read you 2 sentences of that last page that he titled "The Last Word." And here's what he wrote. I console myself with the thought that if this book offends by its assertiveness, God knows that the infinite tactfulness of thousands of other Jews seems to have offended no less. Whatever we do, we are damned. And I would rather be damned standing up than lying down.
100%.
Maurice Samuels, 1924.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Meir, as always, thank you so much for the time.
Meir, absolutely. We'll probably continue again, possibly next week, shortly.
Okay.
And I mean, there's so much on the table right now to be discussed. Shortly, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to be in the United States speaking for Congress, July 24th.
Right.
Which commemorates the League of Nations recognition of the Jewish people's claims. That was on July 24th as well.
You know that, but nobody else knows that.
But no, that's right. That's right. But do the Jews know that, our claims?
Yeah.
That's the bottom line. Okay, Meir, thank you very much. And I'm asking whoever was viewing this, please share this on whatever social media platform you use. Thank you very much, and we'll continue next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Shalom.
Thank you.